Okay, so we are studying the laws of neighbors in Maimonides. We've been doing that for a little while now. The last couple of weeks, we're discussing, there's two chapters in Maimonides, of course, quoting the Talmud, but there's two chapters in Maimonides that focus on the law of what the Talmud calls bar metzra, which literally is Aramaic for the neighbor. And the notion is, and in English it's commonly known as the right of first refusal, the notion is that if I sell my land to a stranger, when I say stranger, I mean somebody not literally neighboring my land, anyone that's not my neighbor, the neighbor has the right to remove the stranger by paying the stranger whatever they paid for the land. That was the basic law. And ever since we presented the basic law, we're focusing on the rationale and the limitations of this law, when it applies and when it does not. And basically the rationale in short was that it is a benefit for me, for any person to have both of their fields next to each other. Because if you have a field, you have to plow. If you have to plow, you have to harvest. So if you have to start schlepping your machinery and your materials from one area of town to the next, it costs you money, it costs you time, it costs you effort. If you can have both of your fields next to each other, wouldn't that be the right and just thing, to quote the verse? The verse says, you shall do what is right and what is just. So the rabbis say, the court, this is an unusual case. Usually the court doesn't get involved in matters of morality. There's a very big distinction in Jewish law between what is the law and what people are encouraged to do morally, but it's not the law. This is an exception. This is an exception to the rule where something you have no legal right. You can sell to anybody, can buy anything, but the Talmud says that we're going to enforce the right of the neighbor to have both their fields together. That was the big principle and the big idea, and we've had all kinds of limitations on this law in the past. Now we're going to have we're going to go a little bit in another direction, but it's going to seem like a very specific law in this regard. But we're going to get to interesting side discussions because it's Talmudic law. So everything leads to the next discussion, and the journey begins. The roller coaster begins. Okay, so we were mentioning various. Let me see if I can find this. Whoops, no, here. We were mentioning various exceptions where the law doesn't apply. We studied the first half of 6 last week. Now we'll study the second half of 6, and maybe we'll get to 7 also. And here it gets to a new topic. Before we get to the second half with the Gentiles, we'll leave that alone for a second. We'll start with the first sentence of the second paragraph within 6. Similarly, when a person sells a field to its original owners, that's the first case. And the case is going to be the neighbor is not given the right to purchase it. So what is the scenario? The scenario is that I have land in this town on Mason Street in Greenwich, Connecticut. But it doesn't really, we're not sure it applies to houses. So let's assume it applies only to fields in the meantime. So I have a field on Mason Street in Greenwich, Connecticut. For whatever reason, I have to sell. I need cash, I have to sell. Talmud says it's never a good idea to sell real estate. You only do it if you have to. Assuming I have to sell my real estate. So I sell it. I sell it to Yankel. Now, a few years later, for whatever reason, I now have money again. And Yankel's willing to sell. So I go to Yankel and I say, Yankel, could I buy back my original field? And Yankel says, you know what? I'll sell you back your original field. In that case, the neighbor can step in and say, hey, I want the right of first refusal. I want to be able to have both my fields next to each other. No, doesn't work. Why? Because the rationale why we allow the neighbor to evict the foreigner who's coming into town is because we want to do what's good and right. Says the Talmud, selling the land back to the original owner is also good and right. That's also a good desired result. It's also the moral thing to do. So therefore, what the neighbor claims to be right for him does not override what is right for the original owner. In other words, we're talking about a society. So obviously, from Talmud's perspective, the idea that a person is connected to their land, The idea that I'm only going to sell my land because I have no choice. And the idea that I can be restored back to my land is considered a value and a righteous thing. And the ability for the neighbor to have both his fields next to each other is a lesser value. Is not I don't know if lesser. It's just as good, and it's not more. And if it's not more, you can't get rid of the original owner, right? So just to clarify, by the way, when I say right of first refusal in America, the right of first refusal only works if you gave the person the right explicitly. In the Torah, it would be in the Talmud, it would be universal. You always have that right, except for the exceptions, and there are many exceptions, but except for the exceptions, you have that right. Okay, so just to clarify again, just to repeat, so I own this piece of land at Mason Street. I decided to sell for whatever reason. I sell it to Yankel. 5 years later, Yankel wants to sell it back to me or sells it back to me. The neighbor cannot interfere. Why not? We say, neighbor, what are you arguing? You arguing that it's good and just. That's quoting the verse. The verse says you shall do that what is good and just. Mr. Neighbor, you're arguing that it's good and just that it's good and just that you should get the land. It's good and just that the original owner gets the land as well. That's also a value that we want to uphold. So that's the first phrase, phrase in number 6. And then we get to the much more complicated, and we'll do that in a second. But in the meantime, if anyone has any comments, questions, jokes, anything else, real estate advice, stock tips, whatever you want to share, now is a good time. In the meantime, I'm going to say l'chaim and some coffee. Okay, now we get to the next part. The next part is where things get a little bit more complicated. So we're going to talk about in the next part of 6 and in 7 about selling or buying from Gentiles. Now we have to just make a few clarifications. Number 1, we're not against Gentiles. What we're saying here, to understand what we say with Gentiles, what we mean here is like this. The Jewish people at that point in the Talmudic times were able to self-rule. They were able to self-regulate. They had a certain autonomy when it comes to legal matters. However, they had no control over the people outside their community, namely the Gentiles. So the problem with the Gentiles were in that context, in that culture, is that if a Jewish person has certain rights, the Gentile doesn't respect those rights because there's no one to enforce it. So when you read, in this case, Gentile, you really have to think about it. If I sell it to somebody, if I sell my land or buy from somebody who is not subject to the rule of law, right? We're not talking about in a society that's established. Think about if we're living out west 100 years ago or 200 years, 150 years ago, when there's no established rule of law. So when we say there could be somebody in the community that does not accept the authority of the community and does not accept the rulings of the community and does not accept the authority of the court, and the court has no way of implementing and forcing the person to cooperate. So that player is a problematic player in the community. And that is going to be the Gentile we're talking about. We're not talking about all Gentiles. We're talking about in that context. So let's go back to the second half of 6. When one purchases it from a Gentile, the neighbor is not given the right to purchase it. Now, why? This is a fascinating law because you're going to see once you get to the commentaries, everything explodes. But what the Talmud says is like this. Now, what Maimonides is quoting. Let's have a scenario. Scenario is that you are living in your field. Next door to you, in the field next door to you, is a troublemaker. What do I mean by troublemaker? He doesn't respect your rights. For example, there are certain rights under Talmudic law that a person is not allowed to do in their field because that may cause damage to the neighbor's crop. For example, I can't create smoke in my field if that smoke is going to travel and ruin your crop. And there are laws how the mazik, the person causing damage, has to refrain from doing certain things that will harm the neighbors. So let's assume there's somebody, your neighbor, who's a Gentile, which is basically saying he does not necessarily keep those rules, and therefore you have no way of enforcing your rights because your neighbor is intruding on your rights. In other words, he's causing certain damages to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. I come in, I go to your Gentile neighbor, and I say, let me buy your land. I give him a good price. So now you come and you tell me, oh, I want the right of first refusal. You just got rid of the Gentile, but now I want the land. Says the Talmud, no. If I purchased it from a Gentile, you can't get rid of me. Why not? So I'll give you the answer that the Talmud says, but then we're going to have to analyze it because it's not so simple. What do I say? You're the neighbor. What's the value that you should? Why do you want? Why do you have the right of first refusal? Because we want that the neighbor should benefit and have both his fields together. So my argument is, by me moving into town, by me purchasing that land from the Gentile, I also did what is good for you. I removed somebody causing damage from you. So what are you going to say? By you buying the land next to me, you're harming me because I cannot have both my fields together? No. I moved in next to you. I bought out your neighbor, the Gentile. Now I did something good for you. Now you want to get rid of me to do something good? I already did something good for you. Leave me alone. That's the argument that the Talmud says. It's not exactly, once you start analyzing it, it's not so simple. But so far, that is the Talmudic statement. Okay, we're studying. Everything is built on everything we say earlier. So if there's any questions or any misunderstandings, jump in. Do not hesitate, please. Okay, but this is not such a simple argument because the post-Talmudic commentaries ask a question. They say, 1 second, I don't understand. You're telling me like this, because I, the foreigner, did the neighbor a favor by getting rid of the Gentile, that's why I don't have to do him another favor by letting both his fields be next to each other. They bring a very interesting example. If you find a poor person who has no clothing and you buy him a suit, does that mean you don't have to feed them also? Because I do one good thing for you, I don't have to do something else to you, right? What is this? What kind of rationale is this that the Talmud is saying? Because I did something good for you, I got rid of the Gentile, therefore I don't have to do something else good for you, allowing both fields to be next to each other. That's the question that the post-Talmudic commentaries, namely the Rosh, asks on the Talmud. So I don't understand. I got rid of the Gentile, I get a mitzvah. Now I'm going to get another mitzvah. I'm going to let both your fields be next to each other. Because I did one good thing for you, therefore I'm not obligated to do something else good for you. That's the question. You see, we're layered. We have the Talmud's reason, and then we have the question on the Talmud's reasoning, and then we have to offer an answer. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I just maybe not understanding. Maybe I wasn't attentive enough. So why would that person who buys the land from Gentile go through all this trouble and get nothing at the end? So what is his incentive? Again, so he's buying the land, he's doing a good thing because maybe not on purpose, but he did a good thing because he bought a land from troublemaker. But then he has to sell it for the same price for the neighboring. So what's in it for him?
So you're asking a good question, but I could ask that question on any transaction. Any transaction, I go and I buy land next to you, and you have the right to get rid of me. I could say, 1 second, I went through the trouble. We said, listen, that's the cost of doing business. I mean, sometimes the neighbor is going to come in and the neighbor is going to ask for it. So
yeah, that's the question that I was struggling with every time, because what's in it for the buyer? Because he keeps buying.
Not everybody wants to buy a house. I'll be honest with you. It's not like today. Where you go and you push a few papers and you sign a few sheets, and any bank will give you $1 million because they want interest, right? It wasn't so complex. It wasn't the most common thing that just because a field goes up for sale, everybody's going to jump on it and buy it. I don't have an extra $1 million under my mattress. If I did, I wouldn't tell you, but I don't. It reminds me of the joke. The joke is that there was a Jew that the thief breaks into his house in the middle of the night and says, "Give me all your money." He says, "You know what?" He tells the thief, "You know what? Let's look together. Maybe we'll find something." So in other words, not everybody not everybody's going to jump to build a cat to buy something that's available on the market. Not everybody will. Right now in Greenwich, there are probably, I don't know how many, but before Corona, there were 500 houses on the market. Not everyone's going to, not every neighbor is going to make the purchase. So you're taking your chances. But the other question is, the question that they're asking on the Talmud is, 1 second. If you're telling me that the reason why I don't have to give the foreigner does not have to, I call him a foreigner, the outsider, the foreigner does not have to give the land to the neighbor because he did him a favor already by getting rid of the Gentile, that begs the question, just because you do one favor for someone, why are you exempt from doing another favor? Just because somebody's hungry and you clothe them, it doesn't mean you don't have to feed. Just because someone is poor and you clothe them, it doesn't mean that you don't have to feed them. What does the fact that you did one mitzvah have to do with not doing another mitzvah?
But that's not a fair comparison, because clothing and feeding are two different things. And here, having a good neighbor, it's on one thing.
Okay. Very good. So maybe you're saying the same thing that the commentaries are saying. I'll tell you what the commentaries are saying. It's very likely you're saying the same thing. So here's how they think about it. He says like this: at the moment of purchase, usually when I want to go buy a land, why am I getting involved? You have no business buying this land. First, go to the neighbor, ask the neighbor if they want it. If they want it, if they don't want it, you can buy it. By the way, you can do it. It's probably a good idea to do. If you want to buy land in the Talmudic system, you go to the neighbor and you say, do you want to buy it? And if they say no, then they lose their right. Right? That's also the answer to Vicky's question of why would I go through the whole effort of hiring a lawyer and surveying the land. Well, you don't have to do it. First, you go to the neighbor and say, you're planning on buying it. If they don't want to buy it, then you keep it and they lose their right. So there are big ways to do it. So the point here is like this. When I'm a foreigner and I walked into this town and I put a bid into this land and I buy it and I close, we say, what are you doing here? Why are you mixing in before the neighbors had a chance to buy? So you did something wrong. We're going to sort of ask the neighbor to, we're going to let the neighbor have the right of first refusal. But in this case, the fact that I stepped in and bought it from the Gentile quickly, and I didn't wait to speak to the neighbors, I actually did a good thing. Why? Because the Gentile could have sold it to another Gentile. Because the Gentiles, again, they don't keep the laws of right of first refusal in the same way. So in other words, the question is, at this moment, when you made the purchase, was there a problem with this purchase or was there not? If there was a problem with this purchase, we say, look, you didn't do anything right. Let the neighbor come. What you did is a little problematic. It really belongs to the neighbor. Let the neighbor have it. But if the moment of purchase, what I actually did something good, then that's allowed to stand because there's no deficiency in my behavior. There's no deficiency in my behavior. You say, why? You should have gone to the neighbor. Yeah, by the time you go to the neighbor, he would sell it to another Gentile. And if he would sell it to another Gentile, you would have two problems. You wouldn't have the right of first refusal, the neighbor, and he wouldn't be keeping the laws of he wouldn't be respecting your rights under Jewish law. So that is just one thing. I just thought it's interesting how you have the Talmudic law, and then you have the layer of the commentaries that try to ask and then ultimately answer. Now we get to one more case, which is also related to the Gentiles, and it's a little bit more complicated, and you're going to see that some of the things we discussed in the past resurface and reappear. What happens if I sell my land to a Gentile? What's the problem? The problem is if I sell my land to the Gentile, to a foreigner Gentile, there's no right of first refusal. Why not? Because what are you going to do? You're going to take the Gentile to the Jewish court and say, give me the land because of right of first refusal? He's going to say, have a nice day, go jump in the lake. Okay? So now we have a little bit of a problem. If I want to go around the law of right of first refusal, I just sell to a Gentile. So what happens if I sell to a Gentile? So here, there's a very interesting law. We have to so first we're going to read it, then we're going to try to figure out what exactly the Talmud is saying and what are the ramifications of what it's saying. And again, it's not a Gentile. When you read Gentile, it doesn't mean we're against 7.5 billion people in the world. When we mean in that context, there's a system of law, and there are people who are above the law. In other words, the law, the legal autonomy of the Jewish people has no way of enforcing any of the rulings on this group of people. So they're a bag of trouble, not them. Potentially a bag of trouble, potentially, as you will see. So let's read I think we're going to 7 now. Yeah, this is number 7. Let me share the screen. number 7, when a person sells a property to a Gentile, the seller is placed under a ban of ostracism until he accepts responsibility for any loss that the Gentile might cause his neighbors, and the Gentile agrees to conduct himself in relation to his neighbors according to Jewish law in all matters. So in other words, what we're saying is as follows. I sell my land to my neighbor, to a Gentile. In some sense, by extension, I'm damaging my neighbors, because now they have somebody who is they're neighboring them, and that person is not respecting their rights and will cause them damage, and there will be no way of enforcing the law. So what the solution the Talmud offers is as follows. The question is, why is a solution necessary? But the solution is as follows. And again, we're going to elaborate and analyze why this solution is necessary. Why isn't there a simpler solution? But first we'll read what the Talmud says, quoted in Maimonides. Says Maimonides, you're going to put the seller in ostracism, ban of ostracism. A ban of ostracism is some form of excommunication. Excommunication was a very powerful tool in the Talmudic times. We could talk about it not up to the modern time, up to 300 years ago. It was probably the most powerful tool that the Jewish court had to enforce its rulings. That was excommunication. But a ban of ostracism is not as severe. Within excommunication, there are levels and degrees of how far you're excommunicated, if people are allowed to do business with you, etc. Ban of ostracism is a lower form of excommunication, but it's certainly social pressure. And I, the seller, I'm placed under a ban of ostracism until when? Until I agree that I'm going to pay my neighbor for any damage that the Gentile causes to them, unless the Gentile agrees to conduct himself in relation to his neighbors according to Jewish law in all matters. In other words, that was the example. The example I said is that under Jewish law, I cannot do something in my property that will damage my neighbor. In those days, that did not exist in secular law, in the law of the Gentiles. In your land, you can do whatever you want. You can harm your neighbors. Doesn't matter. It's in your land. You can do whatever you want. So what we're trying to say here is the solution is you're going to excommunicate me until I accept upon myself, which means in writing, I make a legal acceptance that I am going to pay for any damage that the Gentile who I sold to will cause to my neighbors. Now, that's the solution. Now, the question is why such a solution is necessary. I'll clarify the question in a minute, but that's the solution. And I want to make sure everyone understood it, and then we can ask about it. But let me just finish the number 7 here. If the Gentile compels a neighbor to accept a loss for which he would not be responsible according to Jewish law, the seller is compelled to make restitution. Again, I accept upon myself, I'm going to be placed in a ban of ostracism unless I accept upon myself to pay for any damage that the Gentile causes to the Jew. If any damage that he's not allowed to cause to the Jew under Jewish law, if the Gentile damages his neighbor and doesn't want to pay, then the seller, the person who sold to the Gentile, namely me in this scenario, I have to pay my old neighbor because of the damage that the Gentile who I sold to caused. That is the law. And it's a part of really the previous law of what buying and selling from a Gentile, in other words, in the context of somebody who is not going to keep the law that everybody around them is keeping. That is the law. If everyone understands it, I'll be able to go to the question and see what we could learn from the fact that the Talmud had to come up with a solution and did not come up with easier solutions.
Well, there are some questions. What if the damage is not compensatable monetarily, like, harassment and all this stuff? And this is the first question.
That's a good question.
And then the other question, I had just one at a time.
That's a good question. I don't know that I know the answer offhand. Non-monetary issues. I don't know. I have to look into that. You're going to bill me for, let's say the guy plays music at night. I don't know, right? Or any other form of
that's too mild. It's too mild.
Too mild. The point is non-monetary, something that can't be, it's not physical damage to property that could be quantified very easily. That's a good question. I have to see if anyone addresses that.
But then what's fascinating about that, there is such a stark difference between the Gentile and Jews. So they all kind of stuck together and they all adhere to the same laws. It's not like modern days.
Right. There was no strong state. So that's the point here. The Jewish court had, in Babylonia, the government gave the Jewish court the right to enforce laws for the Jews. So they had a police force, but they can only enforce the laws for the Jews. Doesn't help you to enforce. It doesn't. You can write all the laws you want, but if the Gentile is not going to agree to accept your law, there's nothing you can do about it. So the scenario under which the law is written is completely different. Okay, the question is, why do I need the solution? Why do I have to excommunicate the seller until the seller accepts upon himself any damage that the Gentile is going to do in 50 years from now? Why don't you just say simply, I don't have to accept anything upon myself. If at any point the Gentile I sold to will cause my neighbor damage, then the neighbor will sue me. Why do I have to, lechatchila, at the outset, right? I sell my land to the Gentile, right away I put an excommunication until I write a document saying I'm accepting upon myself any damage that this Gentile will do to the neighbors. If I don't do that, I'm going to be excommunicated or whatever, placed in ban of ostracism, a lesser form of excommunication. Why can't you just say simply, when the neighbor, if the Gentile will cause any damage, then at that point, you'll take me to court, then I'll have to pay.
Maybe that's to discourage from selling to Gentile and also kind of be aware what can that cause in the long run.
Right, but the penalty to me is the same. The penalty to me is that I'm going to have to pay any damage. The question is, do I have to sign it at day one, or do I wait until the damage actually occurs? Right? In other words, let's say in the lifespan of this Gentile, he's going to cause you $1,000 of damage. So I'll have to pay. I'm on the line. I'm on the hook for that $1,000 anyway. What's the difference if I commit it right away at the time of the sale, or I'll have to be obligated at the time of the damage? That's the question. Why is it that immediately, usually if I cause you damage, when do you bill me? If I move into town, I cause you damage, then you'll sue me. Where do we find this strange setup that I have to commit in advance that any damage that will come in the future, I'm going to pay it then. If in the future there's damage, you'll sue me then and I'll pay then.
But the awareness also brings you to the understanding of the non-monetary damage.
Yeah, but there's no non-monetary penalty. You're right. It's awareness. It doesn't look good. They're going to put me, I'm going to have to accept a document. You're right. So there could be this psychological pressure. I agree with you. Agreed. I'm just going to give two other answers that various commentators bring. One commentary is very interesting. One commentary is the Ravid. He says like this. He says, look, there's really no way, if I wouldn't accept the damage upon myself, there's no way you can bill me later. Because I alluded to this earlier, it's very hard to get indirect damage according to the Torah, to sue for indirect damage. To sue that you're going to sue me because I caused damage because I sold to someone else and that person damaged you. It's called garama, it's called causation. Very complicated, it's much harder in Jewish law to sue for damages that are caused indirectly. So what this commentator says, what the Ravid says is really, I'm not obligated to pay any damage that the Gentile pays. I'm not obligated. The only way the court could make me pay it is if I accepted it upon myself, if I committed it upon myself. And that's why they want me to write it right away. That's one answer. Another answer, which is also interesting, is no, is really I have to pay, I'm obligated to pay. The difference is as follows. This is a much broader topic, and that's why I want to talk about it. Under the Talmudic system, if I write a document, let's say for a loan or for a sale or whatever it is, if I write a document that I owe you money, then all the assets that I have at that point are mortgaged to you, right? If I borrow $50 from you and I write a document and I say, I'm going to pay you back $50, then anything I own at the time of when I wrote that document is mortgaged to you. Even if later I sell my property and I can't pay you back, you can go and buy it from the purchase and take it from the purchaser. And the purchaser will come back and bill me, but I don't have any money, right? The point here is it's called anything, when I write a document, all my assets become the guarantors for this commitment. So the Talmud, so this commentary that I think it's the Rosh says as follows. What are you saying? You're saying that I'm going to sell my property to the Gentile now, and you'll say later when the Gentile damages his neighbor, then you'll come after me. Yeah, but then I may not have any assets, right? So when I write a document, when I say they're going to put me in the ban of ostracism until I accept upon myself any damage that will come from this Gentile, what does it mean accept? Accept doesn't mean verbal. In the law, accepting means I sign. Once I sign, now all my assets are mortgaged to this responsibility. And therefore the neighbor who's likely to have received damage is much more protected because can always go after my assets. Even if I sell those assets, it's too bad. He has an earlier mortgage on it and he's more protected. So it's a very interesting discussion of how the post-Talmudic rabbis debate of whether or not I have to accept it to be obligated. In other words, according to the second interpretation, even if I never signed, my neighbor can actually go after me and bill me. He just can't take it from the properties that I sold, if you see what I'm saying. So that goes into the question of how broad the scope of responsibility is. And if I sign something, then all my assets are going to be mortgaged to that. Okay.
So can I just interrupt for a second?
Please.
So let's assume that I'm in Europe, I own property, I sell it to a Gentile. This is back in the 1800s, and I end up then moving to America. So what happens there? How are you going to obtain?
That's a technical question of how do I bill? How do I get property from somebody? How do I bill someone who crossed the ocean? And in this case, we have at least according to the second commentator, there's probably actually an easy solution. Let's say you sold to a Gentile and you're living in some shtetl, and you signed this document that you have to sign, which is the court is going to excommunicate the person until he signs and says that anything that I'm going to pay for any damage that's going to happen in the future. Okay. Now, all the assets that you own in that shtetl are mortgaged to the neighbor, which means if he has to collect, he can collect from any asset you had while living in the shtetl. Now, before you come to America, you sold all your lands. Too bad. The neighbor has an earlier mortgage, right? The neighbor has an earlier claim against that land. So if the neighbor gets damaged by the Gentile, your neighbor can go to the people that you sold the land to and take the land from them. And they will then have to track you down in New York to bill you. If they can't, that's their loss, because they should have known that they're buying land that is already mortgaged, right? If you buy land that already has security, that a security is placed on that land, that's going to affect the land price, right? So you're taking a certain risk. And they knew, because back in the day, you knew who signed securities for what. That's why you have to sign it. That's why it doesn't work for a verbal agreement. It only works when there's a document. A document means there were lawyers, there were signed, the judges approved, there was noise, there was a coil. In the Talmudic language is a coil, there's noise. Everybody knows. What do they talk about in the shtetl? There was no CNN, there was no Fox News. What do they talk about at night? They spoke about, you heard, Yankel took a loan and mortgaged his property. Okay, the whole town is talking about it. Everyone knows. Now when Yankel wants to sell his land, everybody knows, okay, this land, you better be careful. There's a mortgage note on this land, and someone may come collect upon it, which would affect the cost of the price, which would affect the cost of the land.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you. So before you go to New York, no, I'm kidding. Be
careful
of what you sign. Be careful of what you sign, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to say one more short law, and then we'll call it a day, and we'll pick this up next week. And tomorrow we go back to the Talmudic story, and the Rebbe's analysis of the Talmudic story of Rabbi Akiva and his friends weeping. That'll be tomorrow. One other law, it's very short, but we'll just read it. Number 8, the rights of neighbors do not apply with regard to the rental of property. It's not exactly clear the scope of this law, but I think most people say it's completely broad. In other words, if I rent property, if I'm a foreigner and I rent property in a neighborhood, the neighbors can't get rid of me. If I buy property in a neighborhood, the neighbor cannot get rid of me if the neighbor is a tenant, right? It works both ways. If I am renting, if the foreigner is renting, nobody could evict him from rental. If the neighbor who's trying to evict, that's one case. Another case is that I bought land, but the neighbor wants to evict me. But the neighbor who's evicting me doesn't own the land, he just rented the land. He can't do so. In other words, for this law to be evoked, for this right of first refusal to work, both the neighbor and the buyer have to be involved, have to be owners. And the rationale is that, look, the problem with the right of first refusal is like this, that if you're selling land, then the neighbor is going to lose the option of buying this land permanently. Because again, in those days, people didn't just pick up and sell and go to California. People would buy land and live there for 1,000 years or 500 years until the next pogrom. But seriously, in Talmudic times, people lived in Babylonia for 600 years. They didn't go anywhere, right? From the 5th century to the 10th century, they lived in Babylonia. So a sale was almost like a sale. Whenever a sale happens, it's like in your lifetime, this land is not going on the market again. That's in all likelihood. So because of the finality of the transaction, we say, look, give the neighbor a chance. Because you would say, wait 5 years to the next recession. No, people didn't sell their land. So if there's a one-time opportunity to buy land, let the neighbor have it. But if it's a rental, then it's not final. If it's not final, then this law is not triggered. The law is only triggered when there's a final transaction. That's why it does not apply to renters. It only applies to a sale. Okay, this is the law, and this is the story in short. I hope we got a taste, not just to the actual law. These laws don't necessarily apply today, but certainly the Talmudic process of thinking about who is benefiting and how do we benefit and how do we make sure that nobody's getting hurt too bad. Like thinking about the first case we started with. We're going to balance the benefit to the neighbor versus the benefit to the original owner, right? That's because if I sell back to the original owner, that process of thinking, I'm doing a transaction, what are the ramifications for the people around me? And analyzing that is very healthy and very good. And applying our mind to the divine wisdom as articulated to the sages could be helpful in us and in the way we live and the choices we make. And hopefully those choices will be a little bit more moral because of asking the questions. We don't always come up with the right answer, but we still have to ask the right questions. We have to ask the questions and make sure we're thinking about the ramifications of what we're doing in this world. So thank you for joining. This has been lots of fun for me, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rev.
You
I
too.
do have a question.